There's a $2 million top prize to the winner of Underdog's Best Ball Mania III tournament this year. There will be 451,200 total entries, but there will only be one winner of the $2 million. So it begs the question, how do we get first place? Everyone assumes they are drafting to win, but are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? Today, we are going to spill the secret sauce on how to draft teams that actually have a chance to finish in first place. It can't be understated how massive BBM III is. 451,200 entries. That's the equivalent of every resident of Long Beach, California firing a bullet in this tournament. Come to think of it, win BBM III, Snoop Dogg. On top of that, of the $10 million total prize pool, 45% of that will go to 4 entries. $2 million to first, $1 million to second, $1 million to the regular season top point score weeks 1 through 14, and $500,000 to third. Hopefully you get what I'm driving at here. With so much of the money going to the top few spots, we absolutely have to be drafting teams that have a real shot at first place. Otherwise, you might as well just park your money in. Actually, the markets are a disaster. Best Ball probably is your best investment vehicle. But let's quickly review the gauntlet you will have to get through to secure the $2 million and, of course, that sick Underdog ring that Liam won last year. Pay no attention to the Crocs. That's a bug, not a feature. All right, for round 1, that takes place weeks 1 through 14, and you'll need to finish top 2 out of those 12 teams to advance to round 2. Congrats, you did that. So now you're on to round 2, which takes place in week 15, and you will need to finish first in that group of 10 to advance to round 3. 10's not too bad, you got this. Round 3 is in week 16, and yes, you guessed it, you will need to finish first out of your grouping of 16 to advance to the week 17 finals. Congrats, you made it to week 17, the Best Ball Mania III finals, where you will compete against 469 other teams. And yes, you will need to finish top 2 out of those 470 teams to become a Best Ball millionaire. If this sounds daunting, well, that's because it is. But there's good news. Instead of just throwing our hands up in the air saying it's all luck and praying to the best ball gods, trust me, they don't listen. There's actually things we can do to increase our chances of finishing at the top of the leaderboard. And today I'm going to explain why you're likely drafting too scared right now and the secrets to drafting teams that can actually win this whole tournament. It's important to understand that the structure of Best Ball Mania III is essentially 4 different tournaments that are all uncorrelated. That is to say, once you advance from round 1, weeks 1 through 14, to round 2 in week 15, your points start from scratch. BBM III is a what have you done for me lately kind of tournament. Think about it this way with a truly disgusting thought experiment. You could have the second best team in the entire tournament, weeks 1 through 14, but if your team doesn't perform in week 15, you're gonna walk home with only a $10 profit on your $25 entry. We went ahead and crunched the numbers for you, and yeah, that's not a good return on your investment that you locked up for 6 months. What I'm trying to say is the only reason to enter BBM III is to become a millionaire and avoid time with your family, but those don't have to be mutually exclusive. This brings us to the concept of expected value, AKA EV. It's important that we understand this concept before we get into the actual things we will do in our drafts to help us win first place. Expected value is simply the return you can expect on some sort of investment. Like when I tell you there's positive EV in drafting with me while I'm streaming and getting distracted. Hop in these drafts when these idiot streamers are trying to draft and talk to the chat at the same time. It's so plus EV, bro. Here's a super simple way to explain EV. If I offered you these 2 options, which one would you choose? Option 1 is $50. No questions asked. I'll send it over right now via Venmo, PayPal. Just no Cash App, please. Or option 2, we'll flip a coin, and if you call it correctly, you get $500. If you call it wrong, you get 0. So What did you decide? The expected value of option 1 is simple. It's $50. It's not even expected. You know you're getting it. The expected value of option 2 would be $250. That's because 50% of the time you will correctly guess heads or tails, and 50% of the $500 I'm offering you when you're right is $250. That's expected value in its simplest form. So the TLDR is, even though there's a risk in getting 0 when you flip that coin, if your goal is to maximize profit, you should take option 2 every time because the EV is 5 times greater than option 1. So how does this all apply to best ball? What we can do is actually calculate the expected value of each round by comparing the number of entries in each round to the number of prizes going to those entries. We can see here from these charts provided by RotoViz's Michael Dubner that the EV calculation is extremely clear. In BBM III, the EV in the week 17 finals is 529 times greater than in round 1. In our coin toss example earlier, the EV was 5 times greater. You can see that the EV jumps massively each round, and it becomes increasingly clear that we need to be optimizing our rosters for week 17 if we want to have a chance at the 2 million. By the way, because you're probably wondering, hey Pete, isn't BBM III giving out $1 million to the regular season winner too? Shouldn't that adjust our EV calculations? It's true, they are giving out $1 million to the top scorer in the regular season, but that's still only 10% of the total prize pool. And the remaining 90% is all earned in the playoffs, with the majority of that coming in the week 17 championship final. And we can also compare the EV calcs to BBM II last year, where there wasn't a regular season prize, and you can see here it's basically the same EV proposition. So this begs the ultimate question. What is the difference in optimizing our rosters for week 17 versus optimizing our rosters simply to advance to the playoffs? I can hear you at home right now screaming at YouTube, Pete, you can't win $2 million if you don't make the playoffs in the first place. This is certainly a popular debate around the best ball water cooler. Are you willing to build more risky and fragile teams that will have a better chance in week 17 when the EV matters the most? Or is that not possible and you simply want to get as many teams to the playoffs as possible, as many shots on goal, and then let the chips fall where they may? You might remember from our previous video on structural strategies how this predicament was perfectly illustrated by the 0 RB win rates in Best Ball Mania 2. 0 RB teams advanced to the playoffs at a subpar rate, especially compared to anchor running back, but it had a much better advance rate to the finals and therefore a much higher expected value than the other strategies. In a perfect world, we'd be optimizing for both, right? Getting to the playoffs and having a shot in week 17. And a lot of these structural strategies we discuss, like anchor RB, can give us ways to accomplish both. But the reality is there is an actual difference in optimizing for week 17 specifically, and we should be leaning into this. Also, I'm completely ahead of myself. The first step to winning $2 million is, actually getting on Underdog Fantasy. If you've never played before, you can sign up with promo code Pete and they'll match your deposit up to $100, which essentially gives you 4 free entries into the BBM III contest. All you have to do is promise not to snipe these stacks I'm about to discuss. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. How do we actually optimize our rosters for week 17? The first and easiest way to do this is with correlation. For our purposes, correlation is just a fancy word for stacking up multiple players from the same team or from the same game. Now you might be wondering, why would I care about correlation in the first place? In a macro sense, correlation eliminates the number of things we have to get right. Anyone who has ever played DFS is very familiar with this concept. Instead of trying to hit what is essentially a multi-leg parlay on individual plays, you can make a bet that if a pass catcher, say Cooper Kupp, has a big game, then his quarterback, Matthew Stafford, likely will as well. You can see this pretty clearly from this correlation matrix from 4for4's TJ Hernandez. The dark green spots show the strongest correlations, which are a QB to his pass catchers, and then to a lesser extent, a quarterback with the pass catchers on his opposing team, which we call bringbacks in the biz. Over at Establish the Run, Adam Levitan looked at rosters that finished in the top 100 of the DraftKings DraftKings Millie Maker contest, and he found that those rosters use double stacks nearly 40% of the time, and they use single bringbacks 52.5% of the time. It's pretty clear that stacking helps us win in DFS. So back to BBM 3. We know the Week 17 finals will have 470 teams in it, which essentially make it a small field DFS tournament. So here's another thought experiment. If I told you that you could take a shortcut to the BBM 3 finals and hand select your team the Sunday morning of Week 17, what would your team look like? Sure, you'd definitely be hand selecting some of the hashtag best plays, but after that, you'd probably be dialing up a few stacks, quarterback with their pass catchers and maybe even a bring back or two. So if that's what you'd be doing the morning of the Ball Mania III finals, why wouldn't you be drafting like that in the summer? Now that the schedule is out, we can actually start making informed decisions about some of these Week 17 matchups and game environments. One thing we can do is try to identify some of the best potential shootout games. We of course get the Monday Night Football hammer in Week 17, which is going to be the Bengals versus the Bills. By the way, we recently wrote about some of the Week 17 games in the Fantasy Life newsletter. It's a free newsletter that I write. We drop it in your inbox multiple times a week. You can subscribe with the link down below. Now, it will of course be tough to get a lot of players from the Bengals and Bills games because they have such high ADPs, but the point is we should be looking for stacking and correlation across any of the Week 17 matchups when possible. When we look at the top teams from the finals of BBM II, we can see that each team averaged over 3 stacks per game, with an average of 1.7 stacks being a QB with another teammate and 1.5 stacks being 2 non-QB teammates. Take a look at this team that finished in 7th place in BBM last year. They had a Green Bay onslaught with 7 different Packers players and a supplementary Bengals stack with 4 Cincinnati players. In using 11 of their total 18 picks on 2 teams who exceeded expectations, they were essentially able to eliminate having to get so many things right. They basically hit on only 2 things, which was the Bengals have a good year and the Packers have a good year, and that was enough. The TLDR here is simple. The final week of BBM 3 Week 17 is essentially a small field DFS tournament, and we know one of the tried and true ways of winning DFS tournaments is by utilizing stacking and correlation. So we should be treating our best ball drafts in the same way. Would you like to track your Week 17 stacks easily? Well, the aforementioned Michael Dubner has you covered. He has a free Excel tool. You can easily import your rosters and then check out all of your exposures and those sweet, sweet Week 17 stacks. I'll link to that down below as well. The second way that we can optimize our rosters for Week 17 is by making sure we have teams that are unique compared to the field. To expand on our DFS analogy from before, if you were hand building a lineup for the BBM 3 finals, how unique and differentiated would you want your roster compared to the field? Would you want to have the same 5 to 6 players as everyone else in the finals? No, of course you wouldn't, because we know how important it is to have unique, differentiated players when trying to win a tournament. Doing so gives us essentially 2 ways to win. 1, when the popular plays, the chalk fails, or 2, when our unique low-owned guy has a great game. Now, this is inherently very difficult to do in best ball tournaments. There's a natural selection bias to all of the teams who advance to the finals sharing a similar cohort of league winners. For instance, last year in the finals, 66% of all teams had Mark Andrews and 46% had Cooper Kupp. It makes sense that the best teams are going to share similar league winners. This isn't an issue whatsoever in weeks 1 through 14 because no one else in your 12-man league is going to share the same players as you. But this is a very important consideration when we get to week 17 and there's 469 other teams, a lot of which are going to share players that you have. Last year, Liam Murphy was one of the only teams in the Ball Mania III finals that had Noah Fant at tight end. In the FFPC finals last year, Mike Leone was one of the only teams who had George Kittle at tight end. And even though Mark Andrews had a dominant stretch up to week 17, you'd actually prefer not to have him in that context. I know that seems weird, but to reiterate, Liam and Leone essentially had 2 ways to win once they got to the finals. Their unique tight end pick does better than Andrews, or Andrew simply fails and has a dud week. The latter is exactly what happened in week 17. Mark Andrews only scored 12.5 points, while Noah Fant went on to score 18.2 points. So what are the ways we can get unique teams without being stupid? Number one, we can do this by employing structures that are underutilized by the field compared to more popular structures like Anchor RB. And to extend it further, we can even layer a few of these optimal strategies on top of each other to get an even more unique build than the field. As an example, utilizing 0 RB, elite tight end, and 2 quarterbacks before round 13 was utilized by only 0.47% of the field last year. The TLDR is by employing underutilized structures, you're naturally going to get on different combinations of players than the field, which will come in extremely handy in week 17. The second way we can do this is by mixing up our selections at the start of drafts. As ADPs settle throughout the summer, the same players will start to go in the exact same ranges in every draft, which results in a lot of teams then sharing the same starts to drafts. For example, last year, Christian McCaffrey was routinely paired with Justin Jefferson and George Kittle in rounds 2 and 3. Not because people were purposefully stacking them, but because their ADPs were correlated. Christian McCaffrey went at the 101, and George Kittle and Justin Jefferson could always be found around the 2-3 turn at pick 24 and 25. Here's a wild stat. We can see that of the teams that drafted Christian McCaffrey, over a quarter of them had Justin Jefferson and 16% had Kittle. 4.4% of all CMC teams had both Jefferson and Kittle. We want to avoid that as much as possible. It's important to realize that the ADPs of these top 25 players or so is simply a reflection of the market's confidence in ordering them. But often the true differences in their projections or outlook or even range of outcomes isn't that different. On the team I drafted with Eric Bimefor that finished in 8th place in BBM II, we reached for Devontae Adams at 103, even though he had a later ADP, knowing that a lot of teams wouldn't be pairing Adams with Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb, who we got at the 2-3 turn. In fact, there were only 10 total rosters in the entire contest who had that same start as us with Adams, Lamb, and Keenan. To put it in perspective, there were 566 rosters who had the CMC Kittle Jefferson team. A final way to get unique is with our late round picks in these drafts. Best Ball has this unique dynamic where every single BBM III draft, 216 players will be drafted, and pretty much all of the players in the top 200 or so picks will be drafted in every single BBM III draft this summer. So if we can find deep sleepers that aren't selected in the majority of drafts, we can get a huge advantage. For example, last year, Chiefs running back Terrell Williams and 49ers running back Eli Mitchell were both big late round hits. Both contributed a similar amount of points to starting best ball rosters, but come playoff time, we'd much prefer to have Mitchell on our rosters than Williams because of the large gap in ownership. 27.9% versus 5.5%, which ultimately means less overlap with our competition and a clearer path to passing them on the leaderboard. The TLDR is this: we can get unique by deviating from ADP, either at the top of drafts where the top 25 players have a similar range of outcomes and you're not sacrificing too many projected points, or at the very end of the draft where all of those selections are low probability bets. So if all things are equal, you'd rather have the player that's not getting drafted compared to the one who is. In our next video, we'll explore the specific player archetypes and player examples that you can draft to supercharge your team in week 17. How do you handle suspended players like DeAndre Hopkins or Deshaun Watson? How about injured players who might get off to a slow start like Jamison Williams or Michael Gallup? These players probably won't help you out much rounds 1 through 14, but they could be huge difference makers when it matters the most in weeks 15 through 17, where the EV is the greatest. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn notifications on so you don't miss our next best ball strategy video. And in the meantime, feel free to brush up on 0 RB and the other dominant structural strategies that can help you win BBM 3. See you at the top of the leaderboards in week 17.